The year is 1781. A strange, deceptive quiet has fallen over the battlefields of America. In Yorktown, Virginia, the cannons have gone silent. The air, once thick with the acrid smoke of gunpowder and the shouts of men, now carries only the whisper of an autumn wind and the distant cries of gulls over the York River. Lord Cornwallis, the proud British general, has surrendered. His army, a formidable force that once cut a swath through the southern colonies, has laid down its arms. Too many, this was it. This was the end. The victory bells rang from Boston to Savannah. The war, they believed, was over. But was it? Welcome, history lovers, to our new series. Today, we rejourneying back to a forgotten chapter of the American Revolution. The 2 years asterisk. After asterisk Yorktown, it's a period shrouded in uncertainty, a time when the echoes of war still resonated, and the dream of peace was a fragile, flickering candle in the wind. While the decisive battle was won, the war was not. Let's peel back the layers of our history books and discover the tense, dramatic, and often overlooked story of how America truly won its independence. Imagine Uriah Soldier in the Continental Army in late 1781. Uriah huddled around a sputtering campfire somewhere in the Hudson Highlands of New York. You're bone-weary, your uniform is a patchwork of rags, and your stomach aches with the familiar, gnawing hunger. News of the victory at Yorktown reached you weeks ago, a flash of warmth in the encroaching winter. You celebrated, you cheered, you dreamed of finally going home. But the order to disband never came. Instead, you're still here. Thrilling, standing guard, and watching the enemy. Because just across the river, in the sprawling metropolis of New York City, the British Army is very much still there. Tens of thousands of them. Their formidable Royal Navy still controls the harbor, a forest of masts, and Union Jacks dominating the skyline. For General George Washington, the victory at Yorktown was not an ending, but a new, perilous beginning. He knew that one major victory, however spectacular, did not guarantee independence. The British Empire was a global superpower. Losing one army was a setback, not a final defeat. Complacency, Washington feared, was now his most dangerous enemy. He wrote letters, endless letters, to Congress, to state governors, pleading for more men, more money, more supplies. His words were filled with a desperate urgency. The spirit of insubordination and mutiny, he warned, was spreading through his exhausted army like a disease. The men hadn't been paid in months, some in years. Their families were starving back home. They had sacrificed everything for the cause of liberty. But now, with the fighting seemingly over, their patience was wearing dangerously thin. They saw politicians celebrating, yet they were left shivering in the cold. This wasn't victory. It was a bitter, frozen limbo. Meanwhile, in London, the news of Yorktown hit like a thunderclap. When the Prime Minister, Lord North, heard the news, he reportedly paced his office in despair, crying out, "Oh God, it is all over." Parliament was in an uproar. The war had been astronomically expensive, draining the British treasury and costing countless lives. The public was tired of it. The opposition parties seized the moment, fiercely debating the futility of continuing the conflict. But King George III was a stubborn man. He saw the rebellion not just as a political dispute, but as a personal affront to his authority. He was not ready to give up America. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that the colonies could still be brought back into the fold. So, while the politicians in London argued, the military commanders in America had to make their own decisions. The new British commander-in-chief in North America, Sir Guy Carleton, arrived in New York with a dual mandate. On one hand, he was to prepare for a potential evacuation. On the other, he was to hold New York City at all costs and explore any possibility of a diplomatic reconciliation, one that might leave America with some autonomy, but still under the British crown. This created an incredibly tense standoff. Washington's army was too weak to attack the fortified British stronghold in New York. Carleton's army was under orders not to launch any major new offensives. So they watched each other. The war devolved into a shadowy conflict of skirmishes, raids, and espionage. This wasn't the clash of grand armies anymore. It was a no-man's-land war fought in the forests of New Jersey and the swamps of South Carolina. Loyalist partisans, those Americans who remained loyal to the king, clashed violently with patriot militia. These were brutal, intimate encounters. Neighbors fighting neighbors. Families torn apart. In pursuit commanders, like Nathaniel Greene and Light Horse, Harry Lee continued a relentless campaign, slowly but surely pushing the remaining British forces back into their coastal enclaves of Charleston and Savannah. Every small victory was a reminder that the fire of revolution had not been extinguished. This period was a powder keg waiting for a spark. A single misstep, a rash decision from a junior officer, or a full-blown mutiny in Washington's unpaid army could have reignited the entire conflict. It could have shattered the fragile American cause and undone everything that had been gained at Yorktown. The fate of the new nation hung by a thread not on a battlefield, but in the tense negotiations happening in Paris, in the halls of the British Parliament, and most importantly in the hearts and minds of the exhausted soldiers who were forced to keep the faith when all seemed lost. The final echoes of war were a test of endurance, a long, drawn-out final act where the real prize wasn't a military victory, but a lasting peace. The story of what happened next, how diplomats in Paris outmaneuvered an empire, and how Washington held his army together through sheer force of will, is a tale of intrigue, betrayal, and incredible perseverance. The road from Yorktown to the Treaty of Paris was just as crucial as the road to Yorktown itself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into a lesser-known part of American history. If you found this fascinating, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss Chapter 2, where we explored the secret negotiations in Paris and the crisis that nearly tore the Continental Army apart. We'll see ya next time. Welcome back to our series on the American Revolution. Last time, we witnessed the stunning American and French victory at Yorktown, where Lord Cornwallis surrendered his entire army. The world held its breath. Was this it? Was the war finally over? Today, we're diving into the complex and uncertain period that followed the aftermath of Yorktown. When news of the surrender reached the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, celebrations erupted. Bells rang, bonfires were lit, and people danced in the streets. To many, it felt like the decisive blow, the moment the mighty British Empire had finally been brought to its knees. And in many ways, they were right. The surrender at Yorktown was a catastrophic military disaster for the British. It effectively shattered their southern strategy and broke the will of the British public to continue fighting a costly and increasingly unpopular war across the Atlantic. But for the man at the center of it all, General George Washington, the feeling wasn't one of pure elation. It was one of cautious optimism. Washington was a pragmatist, a leader who had seen victory snatched from the jaws of defeat, and vice versa, too many times. He knew the British still held major strongholds in North America. New York City, Charleston, and Savannah were still firmly under their control. They still had a powerful navy and thousands of troops stationed in the colonies and the Caribbean. In a letter to the President of Congress, Washington warned against complacency. He wrote, "I have the highest hope that the late important success will be productive of the most happy consequences, but I must beg leave not to relax our exertions or indulge in sanguine hopes of a speedy termination of the war." He understood that one major victory, no matter how spectacular, did not guarantee peace. The British could regroup, send more troops, and prolong the conflict for years. His greatest fear was that the states, believing the war was won, would stop supplying his army with men, money, and provisions. The Continental Army was already exhausted, poorly fed, and irregularly paid. If support dried up now, everything they had fought for could unravel. So, while the public celebrated, Washington kept his army on high alert. He moved his forces north to encamp near Newburgh, New York, strategically placing them to keep an eye on the main British army garrisoned in New York City under General Sir Henry Clinton. For Washington and his soldiers, the war was far from over. The fighting might have paused, but the state of war remained. They would spend a long, tense winter waiting and watching, uncertain of what the future held. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the news of Yorktown landed like a bombshell. When the dispatch reached London on November 25, 1781, it sent shockwaves through the British government. Lord North, the Prime Minister who had overseen the war for years, reportedly paced his room in agitation, exclaiming, "Oh God. It is all over." It was a political crisis of the highest order. For years, the British Parliament had been deeply divided over the war. The pro-war faction, led by King George III and Lord North, was adamant about crushing the rebellion and preserving the empire. But a vocal and growing opposition, which included prominent figures like Edmund Burke and Charles James Fox, had long argued that the war was a foolish, unwinnable, and morally bankrupt endeavor. They had warned that it was draining the treasury, damaging trade, and alienating potential allies. The surrender at Yorktown proved the opposition right. It was the final nail in the coffin for Lord North's government. The public and political pressure became unbearable. The war had cost Britain dearly, not just in money and soldiers, but also in international prestige. They were now fighting a global war, not just against the American rebels, but also against their old rivals, France and Spain, with the Dutch Republic joining in as well. Britain was isolated and the debate in Parliament was fierce. For months, the government tried to cling to power, but support for the war effort had evaporated. Finally, in March of 1782, Lord North's government fell. It was a momentous event. The new government, led by Lord Rockingham, was formed on the explicit condition that it would open peace negotiations with the Americans. The political will in Britain to continue the war was officially broken. The king, who had been the staunchest advocate for subduing the colonies, was forced to accept the reality of defeat. But even with a new government in London committed to peace, the process was far from straightforward. What would this peace look like? What would be the boundaries of this new American nation? What would happen to the loyalists, the American colonists who had remained loyal to the crown? What about the debts owed to British merchants? These were incredibly complex questions that would take months of painstaking negotiation to resolve. American diplomats, including Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, were dispatched to Paris to meet with their British counterparts. The negotiations were a delicate dance of diplomacy, mistrust, and strategic maneuvering. The Americans had to be careful. Their alliance was with France, and the French had their own interests, which didn't always align perfectly with American goals. For instance, France was keen to weaken Britain as much as possible, while the Americans were primarily focused on securing their independence and favorable borders. John Jay, in particular, was deeply suspicious of French intentions. He feared that France and Spain might try to make a separate peace with Britain that would limit American expansion to the west, effectively hemming the new nation in along the Appalachian Mountains, acting boldly, and some would say. Against his instructions from Congress, Jay opened secret, direct negotiations with the British. This move proved to be the British, eager to drive a wedge between the Americans and the French, were surprisingly generous. They were willing to concede vast territories to the new United States, extending its borders all the way to the Mississippi River. Back in America, the waiting continued. The year 1782 was a period of anxious limbo. While major combat operations had ceased, the threat of a renewed British offensive was ever present. The Continental Army remained in the field, and the potential for conflict was still very real. The most dangerous moment during this period came not from the British, but from within the American ranks. At the Army camp in Newburgh, New York, frustration reached a boiling point. The officers and soldiers had served for years with little or no pay. Congress had promised them pensions, but with the government under the Articles of Confederation being so weak and broke, it seemed unlikely that these promises would ever be honored. Many felt betrayed. They had sacrificed everything to win the war, and now it seemed they would be cast aside with nothing. In March of 1783, an anonymous letter, later known as the Newburgh Address, circulated through the camp. It called for the officers to take matters into their own hands. It suggested that if Congress did not meet their demands, the Army should refuse to disband after the peace treaty was signed. Or, even more radically, they could march on Philadelphia and impose their will on the government by force. This was the moment the entire revolution could have collapsed into a military coup, a military dictatorship replacing the monarchy they had just fought to escape. This was perhaps Washington's finest hour, not as a general, but as a leader. He called a meeting of his officers. He began by denouncing the anonymous letter, but he could see it wasn't having the desired effect. The mood in the room was mutinous. Then he paused and pulled a new pair of spectacles from his pocket. None of his officers had ever seen him wear them before. As he put them on, he said, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." This simple, human gesture had a profound impact. It shattered the tension in the room. Suddenly, the officers saw not just their commander-in-chief, but a man who had shared their struggles, their sacrifices, and their hardships. They were reminded of the cause they had all fought for. Many were moved to tears. Washington then continued his speech, appealing to their sense of honor and patriotism, urging them to have faith in Congress and the new republic. He successfully diffused the crisis. The Nuba conspiracy collapsed, and the principle of civilian control over the military, a cornerstone of American democracy, was secured. Finally, on September 3rd, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was officially signed, formally ending the American War for Independence. Britain officially recognized the United States as a free, sovereign, and independent nation. The treaty established generous boundaries from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River, and from the Great Lakes down to Florida. When the news reached America, true, final celebrations could begin. The war was over. Independence was won. In December 1783, in a deeply emotional ceremony at Fraunces Tavern in New York City, George Washington bid farewell to his officers. He then traveled to Annapolis, where Congress was meeting, and formally resigned his commission as commander-in-chief. In an act that stunned the world, where victorious generals typically seized power, Washington voluntarily gave it up and returned to his farm at Mount Vernon as a private citizen. So, the aftermath of Yorktown was a period far more complex than just a simple end to a war. It was a time of diplomatic maneuvering, political upheaval in Britain, and a near mutiny that threatened the very foundation of the new republic. It was a test of Washington's leadership and a testament to the fragile, uncertain, yet ultimately triumphant birth of the United States. The fighting was over, but the even greater challenge of building a nation had just begun. Thank you so much for joining us for this chapter. The story is far from over. Next time, we'll explore the chaotic years under the Articles of Confederation and the monumental task of creating a new form of government. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more, please hit that like button. And be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode. We'll see you then. Welcome back to our series on the American Revolution. In our last chapter, we left the battlefield at Yorktown, with Cornwallis's surrender marking a decisive turn. But a military victory is one thing. Securing a lasting peace is another entirely. Today, in Chapter 3, we're diving into the crucial and often overlooked question. Why did both sides, after years of bitter conflict, suddenly feel an urgent need to come to the negotiating table? It wasn't just about one side winning and the other losing. It was a story of exhaustion, economics, and a desperate desire for stability. Let's start with Great Britain. On the surface, the British Empire was still a formidable global superpower. But beneath that veneer, deep cracks were forming. The war in America had become an incredibly expensive quagmire. The national debt had ballooned to staggering levels, and the British public was growing weary of the endless taxes required to fund a conflict thousands of miles away. Think about it. Every soldier, every ship, every cannonball sent across the Atlantic was a drain on the treasury. Merchants were suffering too, as the lucrative trade with the American colonies had been severed. The war wasn't just being fought in America. It was being felt in the pockets of everyday people back home in London, Manchester, and Bristol. Furthermore, Britain's focus was being dangerously divided. The American Revolution had never been an isolated conflict. France, seeking revenge for its defeat in the 7 Years' War, had joined the American cause, and soon Spain and the Dutch Republic followed suit. Suddenly, Britain was fighting a global war, defending its interests in the Caribbean, Gibraltar, and even as far as India. The French Navy posed a genuine threat to British naval supremacy. The conflict in America, which started as a colonial rebellion, had morphed into a world war that Britain was struggling to manage on multiple fronts. The loss at Yorktown wasn't just a military defeat. It was a political catalyst. It proved to many in Parliament that continuing the fight was a fool's errand. The political will to keep pouring resources into subduing the colonies was evaporating. The focus had to shift from reclamation to damage control. Peace wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a pragmatic necessity to save the rest of the empire from collapsing under the strain. Now, let's cross the Atlantic and look at the American perspective. While they had secured a monumental victory at Yorktown, the newly forming United States was in a fragile state. The Continental Army was exhausted, unpaid, and restless. The national treasury, if you could even call it that, was empty. The Articles of Confederation, the governing document at the time, gave the central government very little power, especially the power to tax. They had been kept afloat largely by French loans and military support, but that couldn't last forever. There was a real danger that the unity forged in the fires of war could disintegrate in the chaos of peace. The states were bickering, the economy was in shambles, and soldiers who had sacrificed everything were on the verge of mutiny. For American leaders like George Washington, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin, securing a formal peace treaty was about more than just ending the fighting. It was about legitimacy. They needed Great Britain, the most powerful nation on earth, to formally recognize the United States as a sovereign and independent nation. This recognition was the key to everything else. It would open the door to international trade, allowing them to rebuild their shattered economy. It would enable them to secure loans and establish diplomatic relations with other countries. Without it, they would remain a collection of rebel colonies in the eyes of the world, vulnerable and unstable. Peace meant survival. It meant the chance to turn the radical idea of a self-governing republic into a functioning reality. So, you see, the road to peace wasn't paved by one side's triumph and the other's complete capitulation. It was a path cleared by mutual exhaustion and converging needs. For Britain, peace was about cutting its losses, staunching the financial bleeding, and refocusing on its global empire. For America, peace was about securing its very existence, gaining international recognition, and beginning the monumental task of building a new nation from the ground up. Both sides were staring into an abyss of continued conflict and financial ruin, and both decided that the time had come to talk. The stage was set for one of the most significant diplomatic negotiations in modern history, the Treaty of Paris. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and the future of a continent hung in the balance. In our next chapter, we'll introduce the key players who gathered in Paris: the brilliant, cunning, and sometimes conflicting personalities, tasked with hammering out the details of this historic peace. It's a fascinating story of diplomacy, strategy, and political maneuvering. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through history. If you're enjoying this series and want to see how the story unfolds, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter. We truly appreciate your support. See you next time. Welcome back to our journey through the American Revolution. As the smoke from the battlefields began to clear, a new kind of conflict was just beginning, one waged not with muskets and cannons, but with words, wit, and willpower. This was the battle for peace, and America needed its finest minds to secure its hard-won freedom on the world stage. Today, we're diving into Chapter 4, The Call for Diplomats. Meeting the extraordinary team sent to Paris to negotiate the treaty that would officially end the war. Imagine the scene. 1782, Paris. The fate of a new nation rests on the shoulders of 4 men, each a titan in his own right, yet as different from one another as day and night. This wasn't just a diplomatic mission. It was a high-stakes chess match against the most powerful empires in the world. The American Congress knew they couldn't send just anyone. They needed a dream team of negotiators, each bringing a unique skill set to the table. Let's meet these remarkable individuals. First, the legend himself, Benjamin Franklin. By this time, Franklin was already a global celebrity, the embodiment of American ingenuity and democratic spirit. At 76, he was the elder statesman, wise, and universally adored in Paris. The French saw him as a philosophical genius, a scientist who had tamed lightning, and a revolutionary who had helped birth a nation. His diplomatic style was built on charm, patience, and a deep understanding of human nature. Franklin knew how to play the long game. He used his immense popularity to build personal relationships, hosting lavish dinners and engaging in witty conversation in the salons of Paris. He understood that diplomacy wasn't just about treaties and borders. It was about trust and influence. He could disarm his opponents with a clever anecdote or a self-deprecating joke, all while subtly advancing American interests. Franklin was the master of soft power, the velvet glove hiding an iron will. He believed in finding common ground and was willing to compromise to achieve the larger goal, a lasting peace that recognized American independence. But charm alone wouldn't be enough. America also needed a bulldog, someone unyielding and utterly committed to American rights. Enter John Adams. If Franklin was the smooth diplomat, Adams was the righteous, Puritan lawyer from Massachusetts. He was brilliant, principled, and famously cantankerous. Adams had little patience for the elaborate protocols and polite fictions of European courts. He saw them as decadent and corrupt. His style was direct, sometimes to the point of being abrasive. He wasn't in Paris to make friends. He was there to secure the best possible deal for his country. Adams was deeply suspicious of both the French and the British. He believed France was only helping America to weaken its rival, England, and would not hesitate to sacrifice American interests for its own. He famously wrote that a diplomat should be honest and upright, but vigilant and cautious. This vigilance often put him at odds with Franklin, whom he privately criticized for being too accommodating to the French. Adams's greatest strengths were his incredible work ethic, his meticulous attention to detail, and his unshakable belief in America's destiny. He was the team's conscience, constantly reminding them of what they were fighting for. Next, we have the shrewd and calculating John Jay of New York. A brilliant lawyer and a man of quiet intensity, Jay was perhaps the most pragmatic of the commissioners. He wasn't as charming as Franklin or as fiery as Adams, but he possessed a sharp, analytical mind and a deep-seated suspicion of European powers. Jay had served as America's minister to Spain, an experience that left him deeply disillusioned with Bourbon diplomacy. He saw firsthand how European courts operated on a foundation of self-interest and secret dealings. This experience made him incredibly wary of the French foreign minister, the Comte Verg. When Jay intercepted a secret dispatch that suggested France was working against key American interests, specifically access to the Newfoundland fisheries and the Mississippi River, his suspicions turned to certainty. His diplomatic style was defined by caution, secrecy, and a willingness to take bold risks. Jay became the driving force behind the decision to negotiate with the British separately, a direct violation of their instructions from Congress, but a move that ultimately proved to be a strategic master. He was a master of intelligence and counterintelligence, the spy master of the group, ensuring America wasn't played for a fool. Finally, there was Henry Laurens of South Carolina, a wealthy merchant and former president of the Continental Congress. Lawrence's journey to the peace talks was the most dramatic of all. While sailing to his posts in the Netherlands in 1780, his ship was captured by the British, and he was imprisoned in the Tower of London on charges of high treason. He was the only American ever held prisoner in the infamous tower, after nearly 15 months of harsh confinement, which severely broke his health. He was finally released in late 1781 in exchange for the British General Cornwallis. Although he arrived in Paris late in the negotiations and was still recovering from his ordeal, Lawrence's presence was significant. As a prominent Southerner, he brought a crucial perspective on issues vital to the South, particularly concerning trade and debts owed to British merchants. His personal suffering at the hands of the British gave him a unique moral authority. Though his role was less central than the other three due to his health, he participated in the final stages, lending his support to the bold tactics employed by Jay and Adams and ensuring the treaty reflected the interests of all the states, not just the North. So, here we have our team: the charmer, the bulldog, the strategist, and the survivor. Franklin, with his worldly wisdom and unparalleled influence. Adams, with his fierce integrity and legalistic mind. Jay, with his quiet cunning and strategic foresight. And Laurens, with his Southern perspective and personal resilience. It was a team of rivals, often disagreeing on tactics and clashing over person. Adams found Franklin lazy and too pro-French. Franklin saw Adams as rigid and both were initially wary of Jay's independent streak. Yet, it was precisely this blend of contrasting personalities and viewpoints that made them so effective. Their internal debates forced them to consider every angle, to challenge every assumption. They could be charming when necessary, tough when required, and audacious when the moment demanded it. Together, they formed a diplomatic force greater than the sum of its parts, perfectly equipped to navigate the treacherous waters of 18th century European politics. Their mission was clear: secure not just peace, but a peace with honor. A peace that guaranteed independence, vast territory, and economic opportunity for the fledgling United States. The stage was set, the players were in place, and the final act of the American Revolution was about to begin. Thank you so much for watching. The story of how these four men outmaneuvered the old empires of Europe is one of the most incredible diplomatic tales in history. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter, where the negotiations begin in earnest. See you next time. The year is 1776. The ink on the Declaration of Independence is barely dry, yet a new, perilous chapter is about to unfold. America's fledgling revolution hangs by a thread, desperately in need of a powerful ally. The destination, Paris. The mission, to win the support of the French crown. But between the shores of America and the salons of France lies the vast, unforgiving Atlantic Ocean. This isn't just a diplomatic mission. It's a voyage into the unknown, a desperate gamble that will decide the fate of a nation. Imagine stepping onto the deck of a small, cramped frigate. The air is thick with the scent of salt, tar, and palpable tension. Among the passengers is a man already a legend in his own time, Benjamin Franklin. At 70 years old, suffering from gout and facing the very real possibility of being hanged as a traitor if captured, he is risking everything. He knows this journey is as dangerous as any battlefield. The British Royal Navy, the most powerful fleet in the world, prowls these waters like a hungry lion, their spyglasses scanning the horizon for rebel ships. Every sail spotted is a potential threat, every cannon's roar a possible death sentence. The journey begins under a cloak of secrecy. The diplomats, including Franklin, Silas Deane, and Arthur Lee, are not just passengers. They are a national secret, the embodiment of American hope. Their ship, the aptly named Reprisal, slips out of Philadelphia under the cover of darkness. But the ocean itself is a formidable adversary. Barely out of sight of land, a monstrous storm descends. The sky turns a bruised purple-black, and the sea rises in colossal waves that threaten to swallow the small vessel whole. The ship groans, timbers straining against the onslaught. Below deck, men and supplies are tossed about violently. For days, they are at the mercy of the tempest, a terrifying reminder of nature's indifference to human ambition. Surviving the storm is one thing, but outrunning the British is another. The Reprisal is swift, but the ocean is wide and full of enemies. Lookouts are posted day and night, their eyes raw from straining against the endless horizon. On several occasions, a suspicious sail is spotted. Is it a merchant ship? Or is it a British man-o'-war? The tension is unbearable. Cannons are primed, and the crew prepares for a fight they likely cannot win. Each time, they manage to evade capture, sometimes by a hair's breadth, using storms and fog as their allies. Franklin, ever the scientist, calmly measures water temperatures. Ever the diplomat, he writes letters and journals, documenting this historic crossing. He understands the stakes better than anyone. Capture means the gallows, and failure means the end of the American dream. But the threats aren't just from the outside. Espionage is rampant. The British have spies everywhere, and it's highly likely there is one on board, listening, watching, ready to betray the mission. Every conversation is guarded, every glance is measured. Who can be trusted when the fate of a continent rests on secrecy? The diplomats are isolated, surrounded by potential enemies, even among their own crew. This psychological warfare is just as draining as the physical battering of the sea. They carry not just diplomatic papers, but the heavy weight of suspicion and the constant fear of betrayal from within. After more than 30 brutal days at sea, a shadow appears on the horizon. Land, not the shores of mainland France, as planned, but a small fishing village in Brittany. The Reprisal, battered and weary, has made it as Franklin and his delegation step onto French soil. They are not grand ambassadors arriving in splendor, but weary survivors of a treacherous voyage. Their faces are etched with the hardship of the crossing, but their eyes burn with an unyielding resolve. They have crossed the Atlantic, braving storms, evading the enemy, and overcoming the gnawing fear of the unknown. This journey was more than just a physical crossing. It was a powerful symbol. It represented America's determination to exist, to reach out across a vast ocean and forge its own destiny. The hope they carried was not just in their diplomatic pouches, but in their very survival. They had proven that the spirit of their young nation could not be easily extinguished, not by the fury of the ocean, and not by the might of the British Empire. The most difficult part of their mission, the battle for the hearts and minds of the French court, was just beginning. But as they took their first steps in France, they had already won the first crucial victory. They had arrived. This incredible voyage set the stage for one of the most significant alliances in modern history, a partnership that would ultimately tip the scales of the revolution and give birth to the United States of America. It's a testament to the courage and resilience of those who risked everything for an idea. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible historical journey. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the moments that shaped our world. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter. We'll see you in the next video. Upbeat. Historical documentary-style music begins and fades to the background. Hello and welcome back to our journey through the birth of a nation. Today, we step into the gilded, yet treacherous, world of 18th century diplomacy. Our destination, Paris, 1782. Not the Paris of revolutions and guillotines just yet, but a city teetering on the edge, a cauldron of intrigue, fashion, and seismic political shifts. This is our Chapter 6, The City of Negotiation. Imagine the scene. The American Revolution has, against all odds, reached its endgame on the battlefield. The British surrender at Yorktown has sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. But victory in war is one thing. Securing peace and, more importantly, recognizing a new nation's sovereignty is a battle of a different kind. A battle of wits, of words, of whispers in opulent salons and tents, smoke-filled backrooms, and the arena for this high-stakes contest is Paris. Why Paris? Well, France had been America's crucial, if somewhat self-serving, ally. King Louis XVI's government, motivated by a deep-seated rivalry with Britain, had poured money, troops, and naval power into the American cause. Now, as the fighting subsides, Paris transforms into the neutral, yet buzzing, epicenter of negotiation. It becomes a geopolitical chessboard where every major European power has a piece in play. Our players are a fascinating cast of characters. For the fledgling United States, we have a trio of titans. There's the worldly, universally adored Benjamin Franklin, already a celebrity in Parisian society. His charm, wit, and scientific renown make him a formidable, unconventional diplomat. He's the elder statesman, the wise owl who knows how to navigate the complex social currents of the French court. Joining him is John Adams, the fiery, principled, and often cantankerous lawyer from Mass. Adams is everything Franklin is not. He's direct, sometimes to a fault, deeply suspicious of European courts and their decadent ways. He trusts no one, especially not the French, and his diary entries from this period are a masterclass in skepticism and sharp observation. And then there's John Jay, a brilliant New York lawyer and perhaps the most pragmatic of the three. Jay arrives with a deep-seated distrust of both the French and the Spanish, suspecting, quite rightly, that their national interests do not align perfectly with America's. He's methodical, cautious, and proves to be a surprisingly cunning negotiator. This troika of American commissioners, with their clashing personalities and shared patriotism, is tasked with the monumental goal of forging a nation out of a rebellion. On the other side of the table is Great Britain, a wounded but still immensely powerful empire. They send Richard Oswald, an elderly and seemingly agreeable Scottish merchant. But don't let his affable demeanor fool you. He is a shrewd representative of a British government grappling with the humiliation of defeat and determined to salvage as much as possible from the wreckage. They want peace, but on their terms, hoping to drive a wedge between America and its European allies. And of course we have the French, represented by their cunning and enigmatic foreign minister, the Comte de Viet. Vergennes is the grand master of this game. He hosted the negotiations, playing the part of the benevolent ally to the Americans. However, his true objective was to weaken Britain and restore French prestige, even if it meant limiting America's future growth and power. He had his own secret agenda, one that didn't always favor a strong, independent United States expanding westward. Spain, another ally in the war against Britain, is also at the table with its own set of ambitions. The Spanish are deeply concerned about the new American Republic. They want to reclaim Gibraltar from the British, and crucially, they want to contain American expansion west of the Appalachian Mountains, fearing a threat to their own vast territories in Louisiana and Florida. So, the stage is set. Paris in the 1780s is a city of dazzling contrasts. By day, the streets hum with the energy of a global metropolis. Enlightenment ideas are debated in cafes. Scientific discoveries are celebrated, and the aristocracy indulges in lavish parties and theatrical performances. The air is thick with the scent of perfume, baking bread, and intellectual ferment. Salons hosted by influential women like Madame Helvetius or Madame Brilliant de Jouy are not just social gatherings. They're the informal nerve centers of power where political gossip is exchanged and alliances are subtly forged over wine and wit. Franklin, with his folksy charm and fur cap, is the star of these gatherings, a living embodiment of the noble savage and the rustic virtues of the New World. But beneath this glittering surface lies a web of espionage, hidden motives, and diplomatic back. Every delegation has its spies. Every conversation could be overheard, and every letter could be intercepted. The American commissioners were explicitly instructed by their own Congress to do nothing without the knowledge and consent of their French allies. But as the negotiations progress, it becomes painfully clear that France's goals are not America's goals. John Jay, in particular, becomes convinced of French duplicity. He intercepts a secret dispatch that confirms his suspicions. Vergennes is maneuvering behind the scenes to support Spanish claims and limit American territory, essentially trying to cage the new nation east of the mountains. This is a moment of truth for the American team. Do they obey their instructions from Congress and risk being manipulated by the French, or do they defy their own government and open a separate, secret line of negotiation directly with the British? It's a huge gamble. If it fails, they could be disavowed by Congress and left with no treaty at all, angering their only powerful ally, France, in the process. But Adams and Jay, with Franklin's eventual, reluctant agreement, decide to take the risk. They believe that America's destiny, its future as a continental nation, is at stake. So, they begin clandestine meetings with the British envoy, Oswald. They are playing a dangerous double game, telling the French they are merely discussing preliminaries while secretly hammering out the core terms of a peace treaty. It's a masterstroke of diplomatic audacity. They use the French alliance as leverage with the British, while using the prospect of a separate peace with Britain as leverage against the French. The negotiations are intense, covering monumental issues. Where would the new nation's borders be? The Americans push for the Mississippi River in the west and the Great Lakes in the north, a vast expanse that would shape the future of the continent. What about fishing rights off the coast of Newfoundland, a vital industry for New England? John Adams, the man from Massachusetts, fights tooth and nail for this. And what of the Loyalists, the American colonists who had remained loyal to the crown? The British insist they be compensated for their confiscated property, a deeply divisive issue in America. Slowly, painstakingly, through a mix of shrewd bargaining, calculated risks, and sheer stubbornness, the American commissioners begin to win. They secure astonishingly favorable terms. The British, eager to quickly finalize a deal and drive that wedge between America and France, concede on most of the major points. They recognize American independence and agree to the expansive borders reaching the Mississippi. When the preliminary treaty is finally signed in secret, the American team must then face the music with the Comte Vergennes. You can imagine the scene. Franklin, the master diplomat, is sent to deliver the news. Vergennes is, predictably, furious at being outmaneuvered. But what can he do? The deal is done. Faced with a fait accompli and not wanting to risk the entire anti-British alliance collapsing, he offers a mild rebuke but ultimately accepts the reality. He even secures another loan for the United States, a final testament to Franklin's incredible diplomatic skill. This period in Paris wasn't just about signing a treaty. It was about defining what America would become, the secret negotiations, the defiance of their own government's orders, and the brilliant exploitation of European rivalries ensured that the United States would not be a small coastal republic, but a vast continental nation with room to grow. The Treaty of Paris, formally signed in 1783, was not just an end to a war. It was the birth certificate of a future world power written not with swords on a battlefield, but with ink and cunning in the glittering, treacherous salons of Paris. The city of negotiation had tested our founding diplomats, and they had emerged not just victorious, but as the architects of an empire of liberty. Their work here, in the heart of the old world, would echo for centuries, shaping the destiny of the new. Thank you so much for joining us for this chapter. The story is far from over, as the new nation now has to figure out how to govern itself. If you're enjoying this series, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us continue to bring these incredible stories to life. We'll see you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our deep dive into the American Revolution. In our last chapter, we saw the tide beginning to turn with the American victory at Saratoga. But that victory did more than just boost morale on the home front. It sent shockwaves across the Atlantic, right to the royal court of France. Today, in Chapter 7, we're unraveling France's hidden interests. We'll explore why a centuries-old monarchy would suddenly decide to back a fledgling republic. Was it a pure love for liberty, or was there something much more calculating at play? To understand France's decision, we have to rewind the clock a bit, back to 1763 and the end of the 7 Years' War, or as it was known in America, the French and Indian War. That conflict was a global showdown, and for France, it was a disaster. They lost vast territories in North America, India, and the Caribbean to their arch-rival, Great Britain. The Treaty of Paris that ended the war wasn't just a document, it was a national humiliation. The French court, and indeed the French people, were left with a deep-seated desire for revenge, or revanche as they called it. They were just waiting for the right moment, the perfect opportunity to knock Britain down a peg. And then, the American colonies started grumbling about taxes. When the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, French Foreign Minister, the Comte de Vergennes, was watching very, very closely. Vergennes was a master of diplomacy. A shrewd political operator who saw the American rebellion not as a fight for abstract ideals, but as a golden opportunity. He believed that an independent America would permanently cripple the British Empire. Think about it. Britain's power was built on its colonial wealth and naval supremacy. Ripping away its most valuable colonies would be like chopping off a limb. It would drain the British treasury, divert its military resources, and shatter its prestige on the world stage. For Vergennes, this wasn't about helping America win. It was about making Britain lose. But Vergennes couldn't just jump in. France's finances were shaky after the last war, and King Louis XVI was hesitant. Plunging into another expensive conflict with Britain was a huge risk. What if the Americans were crushed quickly? France would be left isolated and vulnerable. So they played a clever double game. In secret, they began funneling money, weapons, and gunpowder to the Continental Army through a fake trading company called Roderi Cortales and Company, run by the charismatic playwright and inventor Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais, the same guy who wrote The Barber of Seville and The Marriage of Figaro. It was a classic clandestine operation, allowing France to weaken Britain without officially declaring war. They were essentially placing their bets, waiting to see if the American horse had the stamina to go the distance. All this time, Benjamin Franklin was in Paris, working his magic as the American ambassador. Franklin was a superstar in France. They saw him as the embodiment of rustic American virtue and Enlightenment wisdom. He played the part perfectly, wearing a simple fur cap instead of a powdered wig, and charming the French elite in the salons of Paris. But his real job was to convince King Louis to move from secret aid to an open military alliance. Franklin argued that, with France's help, an American victory was guaranteed. But Vergennes and the king needed more than charm. They needed proof that the Americans could actually win a major battle on their own. That proof came in October 1777 with the stunning American victory at Saratoga. When news of General Burgoyne's surrender reached Paris, it was the game-changer Franklin had been praying for. The French corps went wild. This was it, the proof that the American rebellion was not just a minor uprising, but a serious military force capable of defeating the British army. The risk of backing a losing side had significantly decreased. Vergennes now had the leverage he needed to convince King Louis XVI that the time was right to strike. The opportunity to avenge the humiliation of 1763 was too good to pass up. So, in February 1778, France and the United States signed two crucial treaties. The first was a treaty of amity and commerce, which officially recognized the United States as an independent nation and established trade ties. This alone was a massive blow to Great Britain, but the second treaty was the bombshell. The Treaty of Alliance. This was a defensive military pact. It stated that if war broke out between France and Britain, which was now almost certain France and America would fight together as allies. Crucially, both sides agreed that neither would make a separate peace with Britain. They were in it together until American independence was fully secured. For the Continental Army, this was a lifeline. It meant the promise of French troops, French ships, and, most importantly, the powerful French Navy. But here's where we see the second part of France's hidden interest. Vergennes' plan wasn't just to help America become independent. It was to ensure that the new United States wouldn't become asterisk powerful. He envisioned a United States that would be strong enough to defend its own independence from Britain, but weak and dependent enough to rely on France for trade and protection. His ideal outcome was a North America divided into three competing powers. Britain holding on to Canada, a new, modestly sized United States east of the Appalachians and Spain, controlling the vast territories to the west and south, including Florida and the Mississippi Valley. This delicate balance of power would prevent any one entity, especially a potentially expansionist America, from dominating the continent. It would also keep the new nation looking to France as its primary European partner. This dual motive became clear during the peace negotiations that would eventually end the war. French diplomats were secretly talking to the British and the Spanish, trying to broker a deal that served France's interests, not necessarily America's. They suggested, for example, that the new United States western boundary should be the Appalachian Mountains, not the Mississippi River. They also supported Spain's claims to the territory between the Appalachians and the Mississippi, because a territorially contained America was a manageable America. A country that stretched to the Mississippi, with all its resources and potential for growth, might one day become a rival, not an ally. The American Peace Commissioners Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay were sharp enough to see what was happening. They realized that their French allies were, in some ways, playing against them at the negotiating table. John Jay, in particular, was deeply suspicious of French and Spanish intentions. In a bold and controversial move, the American team decided to violate their instructions from Congress on their treaty obligations to France by opening separate, secret negotiations directly with the British. They gambled that the British, eager to end the war and drive a wedge between the Allies, would offer them better terms than they could get with France looking over their shoulder. And they were right. The British, seeing a chance to salvage their relationship with their former colonies and weaken the Franco-American alliance, were surprisingly generous. In the preliminary Treaty of Paris signed in 1782, Britain recognized American independence and granted the new nation incredibly favorable boundaries. All the land east of the Mississippi River, south of Canada, and north of Florida. This was a massive win for the Americans, far exceeding what Vergennes had envisioned for them. When Vergennes found out about this secret deal, he was furious, feeling betrayed by his American allies. But by then, it was too late. The deal was done. He had to accept it and sign his own treaty with Britain. So, in the end, France's grand strategy was only partially successful. They achieved their primary goal. They got their revenge. The American Revolution was a financial and strategic catastrophe for Great Britain, and France had the satisfaction of helping to make it happen. But their secondary goal to create a weak, dependent United States failed completely. The savvy diplomacy of Franklin, Adams, and Jay secured a vast territory for the new nation, setting it on a course to become a continental power. Ironically, the massive debt France incurred by fighting the war would become a major factor leading to its own revolution just a few years later. The fire of liberty they helped ignite in America would soon spread home, with consequences no one could have foreseen. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter. The story of the revolution is filled with these complex alliances and hidden motives, and it's a powerful reminder that history is rarely a simple tale of good versus evil. If you enjoyed this video and want to continue exploring this fascinating period with us, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter. We'll see you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Last time, we left the American delegation in Paris, a buzzing hive of diplomatic intrigue. They had their mandate, they had their team, but one crucial piece was missing: their counterpart from across the channel. Today, that changes. Chapter Osho is here, and with it, the arrival of the British delegation. So, who did London send to negotiate the end of a world-spanning war? You might expect a stern-faced admiral or a cunning, seasoned politician dripping with aristocratic disdain. But the man who stepped into this high-stakes arena was someone entirely different. His name was Richard Oswald. Let's paint a picture of Oswald. He wasn't a career diplomat or a military man. He was a merchant, a wealthy Scottish slave trader and landowner, already in his late 70s. Now, I know what you're thinking. A slave trader? How could he possibly be the right person to broker peace with a nation founded on the ideals of liberty? It's a complex and uncomfortable truth of the era, and it's crucial we don't gloss over it. Oswald's immense wealth was built on the suffering of others, a stark contradiction that history forces us to confront. However, in the context of these negotiations, his background as a merchant gave him a unique perspective. He understood economics, trade, and the practical costs of war far better than many of his political masters. He was undriven by the same imperial pride or the desire for military glory that consumed others in the British government. He was, above all, a pragmatist. His connection to America was also surprisingly deep. Before the war, he had significant business interests in the colonies, particularly in Virginia and Florida. He owned vast tracts of land and had spent considerable time there. He knew the American people, he understood their mindset, and perhaps most importantly, he didn't view them as mere colonial ups. He saw them as former business partners, as people he had known and, in some ways, respected. This brings us to his approach. Oswald wasn't sent to Paris to grandstand or to punish the Americans. His mission, handed down by the new, more conciliatory British government under Lord Shelburne, was to find a way out. The war was cripplingly expensive, wildly unpopular at home, and Britain was fighting not just America, but France, Spain, and the Netherlands. They were stretched thin, and they needed an exit ramp. Oswald's initial meetings with the American commissioners, particularly Benjamin Franklin, were characterized by a remarkable lack of animosity. He arrived not with demands, but with an open ear. He was cautious, yes, but he was also genuinely curious. He wanted to understand the American position, to grasp what it would truly take to secure a lasting peace. Imagine the scene. The elderly, world-weary Franklin, a master of subtle diplomacy, sitting across from the elderly, pragmatic Oswald, a man who saw the world through the lens of a balance sheet. There was a surprising amount of common ground. Both were older men who had seen enough conflict. Both understood that the future prosperity of their nations depended on re-establishing trade and peaceful relations. Oswald's instructions were initially quite limited. He was authorized to negotiate, but not necessarily to recognize American independence outright from the get-go. This was a major sticking point. For the Americans, especially John Adams and John Jay, recognition of their sovereignty was non-negotiable. It had to be the starting point, not a prize to be won at the end. This is where Oswald's sympathetic nature came into play. Unlike a more rigid diplomat who might have stuck to the letter of his instructions and caused an immediate stalemate, Oswald was willing to listen. He conveyed the American insistence back to London with a sense of urgency and understanding. He became a conduit, translating the American resolve to a British government that was still grappling with the reality of its loss. In his correspondence with Lord Shelburne, Oswald didn't paint the Americans as unreasonable radicals. Instead, he portrayed them as determined, principled, and most persuasively, for a government concerned with its bottom line and willing to budge on the core issue of independence. He essentially told his superiors, "Look, if you want peace, this is the price of admission. We have to accept that they are a new nation." This was a profoundly important role. He wasn't just an adversary. He was becoming an unlikely advocate for the American position within the British court. He saw that a grudging, half-hearted peace would only lead to future conflicts. He believed that a generous settlement, one that recognized American independence and established favorable trade terms, was in Britain's best long-term interest. Why? Because a prosperous and friendly United States would be a far more valuable trading partner than a bitter and resentful former colony. It was a merchant's logic, applied to the art of peacemaking. Of course, Oswald wasn't a saint, and he wasn't acting out of pure altruism. He was serving British interests. But his definition of those interests was broader and more forward-thinking than many of his contemporaries. He understood that the age of coercion was over. The path forward was through commerce and mutual respect. His cautious nature meant he didn't make grand promises he couldn't keep. He was methodical, careful, and always aware that he was accountable to a parliament back in London that was deeply divided and suspicious of any concessions. Every conversation, every proposal was weighed and measured. This slow, deliberate pace could be frustrating for the Americans, but it also built a foundation of trust. They knew Oswald wasn't trying to trick them with clever diplomatic language or backroom deals. He was, in his own way, straightforward. So, as we close this chapter, the board is finally set. The players are all in Paris. On one side we have Franklin, Adams, and Jay, a trio of brilliant but often contentious patriots. And on the other, we have Richard Oswald, the cautious, pragmatic, and surprisingly sympathetic merchant from Britain. His arrival marks a pivotal turning point. It's the moment the abstract hope for peace begins to take tangible form, but it also raises a host of new questions. Could this one man, with his unique perspective, truly bridge the chasm of bitterness and bloodshed that separated the two nations? Could he convince his own government to grant the full independence and the generous terms the Americans demanded? The negotiations are about to begin in earnest, and the fate of nations hangs in the balance. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive into the arrival of the British delegation. It's these fascinating characters that truly bring history to life, isn't it? If you're enjoying this series, please don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter. We've got a lot more to explore. Until next time, take care and stay curious. Welcome back to our series on the birth of the United States. Last time, we left the American and British negotiators poised to begin their monumental task in Paris. It sounds grand, but the reality was anything but simple. Today, in Chapter 9, we're rediving into the early disagreements that nearly scuttled the entire peace process before it even began. Imagine the scene. Paris, 1782. The ink on the Declaration of Independence is barely dry. The smoke from the battlefields is just clearing. And now, these former enemies are sitting across a table from each other. The tension is palpable. The first major hurdle, boundaries. What, exactly? Asterisk was asterisk the United States. The Americans, led by the astute John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and John Jay, pushed for a vast territory stretching west to the Mississippi River and north to the Great Lakes. The British, however, were reluctant to cede so much land. They proposed a much smaller nation, confined largely to the east of the Appalachian Mountains. This wasn't just about drawing lines on a map. It was about defining the future potential of a nation. Would America be a coastal republic, or would it have the space to grow into a continental power? The arguments were fierce, with each side presenting historical charters, military conquests, and philosophical arguments. The talks stalled almost immediately. Then came the fish. Yes, fish. Specifically, the right to fish in the rich waters off the coast of Newfoundland known as the Grand Banks. For New Englanders, this was not a trivial matter. Fishing was the lifeblood of their economy. John Adams, a proud Massachusetts man, was absolutely intransigent on this point. He argued that access to these fishing grounds was a right, not a privilege to be granted by the British. He declared that the fishermen of New England had always fished there and would continue to do so. The British negotiator, Richard Oswald, saw this as an outrageous demand. How could a newly independent nation expect to retain the economic benefits of the British Empire? To them, American independence meant being cut off from these traditional rights. The diaries from this period show just how heated the debate became. Adams threatened to walk away entirely, risking a return to war over the right to catch cod. The negotiations were on the brink of collapse for the second time. The third explosive issue was the fate of the Loyalists. These were American colonists who had remained loyal to the British Crown during the war. Many had lost their homes, their land, and their fortunes, confiscated by the new state governments. London felt a deep obligation to these loyal subjects and demanded that the United States restore their property and compensate them for their losses. For the Americans, this was a bitter pill to swallow. How could they reward those they considered traitors? People who had fought against them, spied for the British, and in some cases, participated in brutal raids on patriot communities. The American states were fiercely independent and had already sold off much of the confiscated Loyalist property to fund the war effort. The Continental Congress had no real power to force the states to comply, even if they wanted to. Franklin, ever the diplomat, tried to find a middle ground, but the emotional wounds were too raw. John Jay, who had seen firsthand the devastation in New York caused by Loyalist militias, was particularly resistant. This issue became a moral and political firestorm, pushing the fragile peace talks to the breaking point yet again. These three issues, boundaries, fishing rights, and Loyalist property, formed a seemingly insurmountable wall. Each point was a deal-breaker for one side or the other. The correspondence from the time reveals moments of deep despair. The delegates wrote of sleepless nights, of frustrating circular arguments, and of the very real fear that all the sacrifice of the war would be for nothing. The dream of peace was tantalizingly close, yet it seemed to recede with every argument. It felt like the entire negotiation was built on a foundation of sand, ready to be washed away by the tide of old animosities. The talks nearly collapsed, not once, but several times. Each day brought a new crisis, a new threat to walk away. It was a high-stakes diplomatic chess match where one wrong move could plunge the nations back into conflict. So how did they pull it back from the brink? How did they navigate these treacherous waters to finally reach an agreement? It required a masterful blend of stubborn principle, clever compromise, and sheer exhaustion. The personalities of the negotiators played a huge role. You had Adams, the bulldog, refusing to back down. You had Franklin, the world-famous charmer, using his wit and reputation to smooth ruffled feathers. And you had Jay, the pragmatic lawyer, who became increasingly suspicious of not just the British, but also their supposed French allies. The dynamic between these three men was critical. They didn't always agree with each other, but they shared a common goal: securing a strong and lasting peace for their new nation. They began to realize that standing firm on some points allowed them to be flexible on others. They started to look for creative solutions, to reframe the problems, and to make concessions that didn't compromise their core objectives. It was a slow, grueling process of give and take, what ultimately broke the deadlock. A combination of factors. The British government itself was unstable, and the new leadership was eager to finalize the peace and move on. They needed to refocus their resources on their global empire, particularly in India. This political pressure in London gave the American negotiators an unexpected advantage. Furthermore, John Jay's growing distrust of France led him to open a secret, separate channel of communication with the British. He suspected the French were trying to limit American power for their own benefit, and he gambled that a direct deal with Britain would yield better terms. This bold, and technically unauthorized, move shifted the entire dynamic of the negotiations. It allowed the Americans and the British to hammer out their differences without French interference. This back-channel diplomacy was the key that unlocked the stalemate. They agreed that Congress would earnestly recommend that the states restored Loyalist property, a phrase that satisfied British honor but had little legal force. A classic diplomatic ambiguity. On boundaries and fishing, The British made significant concessions, granting the Americans nearly everything they had asked for. It was a stunning diplomatic victory, snatched from the jaws of failure. The preliminary Articles of Peace were signed in November 1782. The early disagreements, which had seemed so impossible to resolve, had been overcome through a mix of tenacity, strategic thinking, and a willingness to take calculated risks. The path was finally clear for the formal treaty that would officially end the war and recognize the United States of America as a new nation on the world stage. And that's where we'll leave it for today. The story of these negotiations is a powerful reminder that peace is often just as hard won as any battle. Next time, we'll explore the final Treaty of Paris and the dramatic reactions to it on both sides of the Atlantic. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this chapter of history as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next episode. We love hearing from you, so please leave your thoughts and questions in the comments below. See you next time. Welcome back to our series on the American Revolution. In our last chapter, we celebrated the monumental victory at Yorktown. But winning a war on the battlefield is one thing. Winning the peace at the negotiating table is an entirely different battle. One fought not with cannons and muskets, but with words, wits, and clandestine maneuvers. Today, we delve into Chapter 10, The Secret Negotiations, a tally of high-stakes diplomacy that could have either secured American independence or plunged the fledgling nation back into chaos. After Yorktown, the world watched. The British were defeated, but not entirely broken. They still had major cities like New York and Charleston. The French, our crucial allies, had their own ambitions. And the United States, a loose confederation of states, was financially exhausted and politically fragile. The stage was set in Paris for the peace talks, a complex diplomatic chess match with multiple players, each with their own secret agenda. Representing America were three extraordinary, yet profoundly different men. Benjamin Franklin, the wise, worldly, and universally charming elder statesman, already a celebrity in Paris. John Adams, the brilliant, principled, but often cantankerous lawyer from Massachusetts. And John Jay, a cautious, meticulous, and deeply suspicious New Yorker. Their official instructions from the Continental Congress were crystal clear. Do nothing without the knowledge and consent of our French allies. This seemed simple enough. After all, France had been their lifeline, providing money, troops, and a navy. Why wouldn't they trust them? But as the negotiations began, John Jay's suspicions started to grow. He noticed that the French foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, seemed to be playing a double game. Vergennes was a master of European power politics. His primary goal wasn't necessarily a strong and independent United States, but a weakened Britain and a new balance of power in Europe, where France held the advantage. A weak America, dependent on France, would serve that purpose perfectly. Jay intercepted a secret dispatch. This piece of intelligence confirmed his worst fears. Vergennes was quietly advising the British to limit America's western expansion to the Appalachian Mountains. He also supported Spain's claim to the entire Mississippi River Valley, which would have strangled American trade and future growth. To France and Spain, a powerful, coast-to-coast American republic was a potential future rival, not a welcome new member of the global community. They had helped America break free from Britain, but now they intended to keep it in a small, manageable cage. The American commissioners were at a crossroads. Their official orders from Congress were to follow Francis's lead. But it was now painfully obvious that France's interests were not America's interests. To follow their orders would be to betray the very future they had fought for. To defy their orders, and to defy France, was a gamble of epic proportions. If their secret dealings were exposed, they could face a diplomatic scandal that would shatter the French-American alliance, leaving the United States isolated and at the mercy of a vengeful Britain. This is where the personalities of our three negotiators truly came to the fore. John Adams, ever distrustful of European courts and French aristocracy, readily agreed with Jay. He believed that Vergennes viewed Americans as pawns. Benjamin Franklin, however, was hesitant. Ada, deep personal affection for France, and a strong relationship with he understood the immense debt America owed their ally and was reluctant to risk that friendship. For weeks, Jay and Adams argued their case, presenting Franklin with mounting evidence of French duplicity. The turning point came when the British, sensing a crack in the alliance, sent their own secret envoy, Richard Oswald, to meet with the Americans. Oswald was a merchant, not a diplomat, and he was surprisingly candid. He signaled that Britain was prepared to be far more generous than the French or Spanish would ever allow. They were willing to recognize full American independence, grant vast territories stretching to the Mississippi River, and secure fishing rights off the Canadian coast. Why would the British be so generous? They were playing their own game. By offering a magnanimous peace to the Americans, they hoped to drive a wedge between America and France. A swift, separate peace would allow Britain to focus its resources on fighting France and Spain elsewhere in the world. More importantly, a reconciled America could become a valuable trading partner once again, severing its economic dependence on France. It was a classic, the enemy of my enemy is my friend strategy. Faced with this incredible opportunity, Franklin finally relented. The three Americans made a momentous and risky decision. They would break their instructions from Congress. They would betray the trust of their French allies. They would enter into secret, direct negotiations with Great Britain. Imagine the tension in those backroom meetings in Paris. The American delegates, representing a nation that barely existed, were negotiating in secret with the empire they had just defeated, all while trying to hide their actions from the very ally who had made their victory possible. One wrong move, one leaked document, and the entire diplomatic structure could come crashing down. They hammered out the preliminary articles of peace. The terms were stunningly favorable to the United States. Britain recognized American independence. The new nation's boundaries would extend west to the Mississippi River, north to the Great Lakes, and south to Florida. American fishermen were granted access to the rich fishing grounds of the Grand Banks. In return, the Americans agreed to recommend that states restore confiscated property to loyalists and honor pre-war debts to British merchants. With the preliminary treaties secretly signed with Britain in November 1782, the time came to face the music. Franklin was tasked with the delicate mission of informing Vergennes of what they had done. It was one of the most masterful diplomatic performances of his career. He went to Vergennes, not with a defiant confession, but with a gentle, almost apologetic explanation. He framed their separate negotiations, not as an act of betrayal, but as a minor indiscretion, a slight bending of the rules that had ultimately secured a peace beneficial to everyone by speeding up the process. Vergennes was, of course, furious. He felt tricked and outmaneuvered. He wrote an indignant letter to Franklin, accusing the Americans of duplicity. But what could he do? The deal was done. To publicly denounce the Americans would be to admit his own diplomatic failure and shatter the image of French influence. And, in a final, audacious move, Franklin, after admitting their impropriety, managed to secure yet another loan from the French treasury to help the struggling United States. It was a stroke of genius, confessing a fault and asking for money in the same breath. In the end, Vergennes had to accept the reality. The separate American treaty put pressure on both France and Spain to conclude their own negotiations with Britain. The final Treaty of Paris was signed by all parties in September 1783, officially ending the American Revolutionary War. The secret negotiations were a masterclass in diplomacy, a high-wire act performed without a safety net. John Jay's suspicion, John Adams's stubborn integrity, and Benjamin Franklin's unparalleled charm and wit combined to achieve what seemed impossible. They defied their government, deceived their allies, and in doing so, secured a future for the United States that was far grander and more expansive than anyone could have imagined. They didn't just win the war, they won the peace, ensuring that the new republic would have the land, resources, and independence it needed to grow into a continental nation. It was a risky, controversial, and ultimately triumphant gamble that shaped the map of North America forever. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into one of the most fascinating chapters of American history. The story isn't over yet, and we have many more tales to tell. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter. We'll see you next time.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our journey through American history. Today, we've arrived at a truly momentous chapter, a turning point that would forever change the course of a nation and the world. We're talking about the moment the dream of independence became a tangible reality. For years, the American colonies had been locked in a grueling, bloody conflict with the most powerful empire on earth. The fight for liberty had been waged on battlefields, in town squares, and in the hearts of every man and woman who dared to imagine a future free from the crown. The Declaration of Independence in 1776 was a bold, defiant proclamation, but it was just that declaration. The war was the brutal, uncertain process of making that declaration stick. Imagine the scene. The smoke of battle had barely cleared from Yorktown. The surrender of Cornwallis was a stunning victory, a David and Goliath moment that sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. But even then, victory wasn't guaranteed. Peace was fragile, and independence was still a concept being debated in the corridors of power in London and Paris. The British public was weary of the costly war, and Parliament was in turmoil. The question on everyone's mind was, what happens now? Would Britain double down, sending more troops to crush the rebellion once and for all, or would they finally relent? This period, between the last major battle and the final peace treaty, was filled with tension and uncertainty. For the Continental Army, still camped and on alert, it was a time of immense strain. Soldiers who hadn't been paid, who were far from their homes, and families had to hold the line. Not against enemy muskets, but against their own doubt and exhaustion. General George Washington had the monumental task of keeping the army together, preventing mutiny, and ensuring that the military did not overstep its bounds and threaten the fragile new republic it had fought to create. He understood that the war wasn't truly over until the politicians and diplomats had done their work. Across the ocean, a different kind of battle was being waged, battle of words, wits, and diplomacy. American representatives, including the brilliant trio of John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and John Jay, were dispatched to Paris. Their mission was anything but simple. They had to navigate the complex web of European politics, playing the interests of France and Spain against those of Great Britain. France had been a crucial ally, but their support wasn't purely altruistic. They had their own goals, which didn't always align perfectly with America's. Franklin, with his folksy charm and sharp intellect, was a master of diplomacy in the French court. Adams, ever the principled and sometimes stubborn lawyer, ensured American interests were never compromised. And John Jay, ever vigilant, was wary of European entanglements, pushing for a direct and clear path to peace with Britain. The British side was in a state of flux. Lord North's government, which had prosecuted the war, had fallen. A new administration, more inclined towards peace, came to power. They recognized the futility of continuing the fight. The war had drained the treasury, damaged trade, and there was little public appetite for more conflict. They were ready to cut their losses, but on what terms? The initial British proposals were attempts to salvage something from the defeat, perhaps keeping certain territories or securing special trading privileges. But the American negotiators stood firm. Their mandate was clear: nothing short of full, unconditional recognition of the United States as a free, sovereign, and independent nation would be acceptable. This was their non-negotiable starting point. Think about the weight of that responsibility. These men held the fate of millions in their hands. Every word in the treaty, every line on the map they were drawing, would have consequences for generations to come. They weren't just ending a war. They were defining the very existence of a new country. They had to secure not just peace, but a viable future. This meant defining borders pushing the western boundary to the Mississippi River. A massive expansion that would fuel the nation's growth for the next century. They also had to negotiate fishing rights off the coast of Canada, a vital economic issue for New England, and settle the treatment of loyalists who had supported the Crown. Each point was a potential deal-breaker, requiring incredible skill and patience to resolve. After months of intense, often frustrating negotiations, the breakthrough finally came. In the fall of 1782, the preliminary Articles of Peace were agreed upon. Then, on September 3, 1783, the definitive Treaty of Paris was signed. Let's pause and absorb the significance of that date. With the stroke of a pen, Great Britain formally recognized the United States of America. The first article of the treaty is one of the most powerful sentences in American history. It states that His Britannic Majesty acknowledges the said United States to be free, sovereign, and independent states. That's it. The acknowledgement. The war was officially over. The rebellion had become a revolution. The colonies had become a country. When the news of the treaty finally reached American shores, it was met with a wave of jubilation and profound relief. Bells rang out from church steeples, bonfires lit up the night sky, people celebrated in the streets. The dream, which had seemed so audacious and impossible just a few years earlier, was now a recognized fact on the world stage. The price had been incredibly high in lives lost, families shattered, and fortunes ruined. But in that moment of confirmation, the sacrifice felt validated. They had not just won a war, they had won the right to determine their own destiny. This moment of definition, this formal recognition, was the true conclusion of the Revolutionary War. It closed the chapter on colonial rule and opened a new unwritten one, the challenge of building a nation. The fighting was over, but the hard work of creating a more perfect union was just beginning. The problems of governance, of uniting 13 disparate states, of living up to the ideals of liberty and equality laid out in the Declaration, all of these challenges lay ahead. But now they would face these challenges not as subjects of a distant king, but as citizens of their own free and independent republic. It was the end of one struggle and the dawn of another, a future they now held firmly in their own hands. Thank you so much for joining me for this pivotal chapter in our story. It's a testament to the power of perseverance and the courage to define one's own identity. If you found this journey as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button. And be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. We have a lot more ground to cover. Until next time, stay curious.
Hello, and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, we're diving into a story you might think is just about lines on a map, but it is so much more. We're exploring Chapter 12, Drawing the Boundaries. This is the incredible, painstaking tale of how the early United States carved its identity, not just an ideology, but literally onto the land itself. Forget neat lines drawn in a comfortable office. This was a saga of sweat, struggle, and survival. Imagine this. The year is 1783. The Treaty of Paris has just been signed, ending the Revolutionary War. America is officially a new nation. But what does that even mean on the ground? The treaty gives a vague description. From the Atlantic to the Mississippi River, from the Great Lakes down to Spanish Florida. But these were just words on paper. The actual land was a vast, untamed wilderness of dense forests, treacherous mountains, and winding rivers that no one had accurately charted. The task fell to a small, incredibly resilient group of people. The surveyors, these weren't just map makers. They were explorers, diplomats, and pioneers all rolled into one. Armed with heavy, often imprecise instruments like compasses, chains, and astronomical clocks, they ventured into the unknown. Their job was to turn diplomatic agreements into physical reality. Let's talk about the northern border with what was then British North America, or Canada. The treaty mentioned the St. Lawrence River in the Great Lakes, which sounds simple enough. But which channel of the river? Which islands belonged to whom? These weren't just academic questions. They determined control over vital waterways, trade routes, and military positions. Survey teams spent years navigating these waters, braving harsh weather and dealing with complex geographical puzzles. It was a slow, methodical process, setting markers and making astronomical observations, often in freezing conditions, to establish a line that both nations could agree upon. Then there was the western frontier, the mighty Mississippi River. This was the lifeline of the West, the main artery for trade and transportation. Securing this border was absolutely crucial for the young nation's economic survival and expansion. Surveyors had to follow its meandering path for thousands of miles, documenting every twist and turn. They faced relentless mosquitoes, diseases like malaria, and the constant challenge of navigating through swamps and dense riverbanks. Their work ensured that this vital waterway would be the backbone of American commerce for centuries to come. Perhaps the most challenging and contentious border was in the south, with Spanish Florida. The 31st parallel was designated as the boundary. But finding and marking a straight line across hundreds of miles of rugged terrain was a monumental feat. This region was a geopolitical hotspot, a place of shifting allegiances between the United States, Spain, and powerful Native American confederations like the Creek and Cherokee, who rightfully saw this line drawing as an intrusion on their ancestral lands. Surveyors like Andrew Ellicott were tasked with this perilous job. His expedition was a true epic. They had to cut a path, called a visto, through thick forests and swamps, wide enough to be seen from one observation point to the next. They battled heat, humidity, and tropical storms. They also had to be skilled negotiators, constantly navigating tense encounters with Spanish officials who tried to obstruct their work, and with Native American leaders who were understandably wary of these men carving up their world. Think about the sheer physical labor. The surveyors and their crews would carry a Gunter's chain, a heavy, 66-foot-long chain made of 100 iron links. They would stretch it out, mark the end, and then drag it forward again, obed and obed through mud, brush, and across streams, all day long. At night, They'd make precise astronomical readings to correct their course, fighting off exhaustion and the elements. Every foot of the border was earned through immense physical and mental effort. These boundary lines weren't just geographical, they were deeply political. Every marker placed in the ground was a statement of sovereignty, a declaration of control. It defined who was a citizen, where laws applied, and where the nation's authority ended. The work of these surveyors was fundamental to building the United States as a functional, governable entity. They were laying the very foundation of the nation's physical form. The maps they created were more than just drawings. They were triumphs of science and human endurance. They transformed abstract treaty language into a tangible reality, shaping the flow of settlement, the course of trade, and the destiny of the continent. Without their grueling work, the United States as we know it today, with its defined territory and clear borders, simply wouldn't exist. Their story is a powerful reminder that history is not just made in council chambers and battlefields, but also in the quiet, persistent work of individuals facing the vastness of the wilderness. So, the next time you look at a map of the United States, remember the incredible human story behind those lines. Remember the surveyors who braved the unknown to draw the boundaries of a new nation. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this journey into the past as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next chapter. We'd love to have you with us as we continue to explore the stories that shaped our world. See you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our deep dive into the foundations of American history. Today, we resetting sail for the stormy waters of diplomacy and economics as we explore Chapter 13, Economic and Fishing Rights. It's a story about more than just fish. It's about the very livelihood of a new nation and the grit of its people. Picture this. The American Revolution is over. The ink on the Treaty of Paris is barely dry, and the young United States is trying to find its footing on the world stage. For the haughty fishermen of New England, one question loomed larger than any other. Would they still have access to the Grand Banks off the coast of Newfoundland? Now, why were the Grand Banks so important? Think of them as the 18th century equivalent of a massive, underwater gold mine. This vast, shallow area where the cold Labrador Current met the warm Gulf Stream created an unparalleled breeding ground for cod. For centuries, these waters had been the lifeblood of coastal communities in New England. Fishing wasn't just a job. It was a way of life, a cultural cornerstone, and the engine of the regional economy. The salted cod they harvested was a staple food source and a crucial export commodity, traded for molasses, sugar, and other goods in the West Indies. Without access to the Grand Banks, the economic future of New England looked bleak. The problem was, with American independence, these fishermen were no longer British subjects. The British Empire, not exactly thrilled about losing its colonies, was in no mood to grant favors. They argued that access to these prime fishing grounds, now in British North American waters, was a privilege of the empire, a privilege the Americans had forfeited. This set the stage for a tense and critical diplomatic showdown. The British aimed to cripple their former colonies' maritime trade and bolster their own fishing industry in places like Nova Scotia. For them, it was simple. No empire, no fish. This is where the American negotiating Team John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and John Giselle into action. And no one fought harder for the fishermen than John Adams. Hailing from Massachusetts, Adams understood viscerally what was at stake. He knew that to deny New England access to the Grand Banks would be an economic death sentence. He wasn't just negotiating for a clause in a treaty. He was fighting for the survival of entire towns, for the families whose dinner tables and futures depended on that catch. The negotiations were grueling. The British were stubborn, and even Adams's fellow negotiators, like Frank, were initially willing to compromise on fishing rights in exchange for other concessions. But Adams was relentless. He argued with a fiery passion that fishing in these waters wasn't a privilege to be granted, but a right that had been earned through generations of toil and risk. He contended that Americans had fought and bled alongside the British to secure these territories from the French, and their historical claim was undeniable. He declared that he would rather go back to war than give up the fishing rights. His position was uncompromising. The fishermen of New England must have the liberty to fish on the Grand Banks, just as they always had. His persistence was extraordinary. He prepared detailed reports. He argued day and night, and he wore down the opposition with sheer force of will and logic. He framed the issue not just as an economic necessity for New England, but as a matter of national honor and sovereignty for the entire United States. He knew that a nation that could unsecure the basic livelihoods of its citizens was a weak nation. And in the end, Adams's bulldog tenacity paid off. Article 3 of the final Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, was a monumental victory. It did unjust grant Americans the liberty to fish on the Grand Banks and in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, but it also gave them the right to land on the unsettled shores of Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, to dry and cure their catch-these-was-ooge. It wasn't everything they wanted. They could undry their fish in settled harbors, but it was more than enough. It secured the foundation of the New England fishing industry for generations to come. The impact of this victory cannot be overstated. It was a clear signal that the United States was not a weak, dependent nation, but a sovereign power capable of defending its economic interests. For the fishermen, it meant they could return to the waters their fathers and grandfathers had worked. The schooners could once again set sail from Gloucester, Marblehead, and Salem, their holds ready to be filled with the bounty of the sea. This diplomatic triumph ensured that the maritime economy of New England would not only survive but thrive, continuing to be a cornerstone of American prosperity and identity. So, when we look back at the birth of the United States, let's remember the diplomats who fought with words as fiercely as soldiers fought with muskets. The story of Chapter 13 is a powerful reminder that sometimes the future of a nation can hinge on something as seemingly simple as the right to cast a net into the sea. It was a victory for the common man, a testament to the importance of perseverance, and a crucial step in building the economic foundations of America. Thanks so much for joining me on this historical voyage today. If you found this interesting, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more stories like this. Drop a comment below with your thoughts, and we'll see you in the next chapter. Hey everyone, welcome back to our deep dive into the American Revolution. We often celebrate the patriots who fought for independence, but have you ever stopped to think about what happened to those who didn't? What about the Americans who remained loyal to the British Crown? Their story is one of the most complex and often heartbreaking chapters of this era. Today, we're exploring the fate of the Loyalists. Imagine your country is on the brink of war, and you have to choose a side. For roughly 1/3 of the American colonial population, the choice wasn't to rebel. These were the Loyalists, also known as Tories. They weren't a monolithic group. Some were wealthy elites, deeply connected to the British system. Others were recent immigrants who felt a strong tie to their mother country. Many were simply ordinary farmers, merchants, and artisans who feared the chaos and uncertainty of revolution. They believed in reform, not rebellion, and saw the British government as the legitimate authority. For them, the patriots weren't freedom fighters. They were dangerous radicals, threatening to tear society apart. This wasn't just a political disagreement. It was a fundamental clash of worldviews happening right in their own towns and villages. As the revolutionary fervor grew, so did the pressure to conform. Staying neutral became nearly impossible. Committees of safety sprung up in towns across the colonies, acting as a sort of revolutionary police force. They demanded that citizens sign oaths of allegiance to the patriot cause. Refusing to sign could brand you a loyalist, and that came with serious consequences. Your name might be published in the local newspaper, marking you for public scorn. Neighbors you'd known your whole life might suddenly see you as an enemy. You could be ostracized, boycotted from doing business, and subjected to public humiliation. One of the most infamous methods was tarring and feathering, a brutal and painful ordeal designed to shame and terrorize. Suddenly, your personal beliefs could make you a target in your own community. When the war officially broke out, the situation for Loyalists became even more dire. Many states passed laws specifically targeting them. These confiscation acts allowed revolutionary governments to seize the property of known Loyalists. Imagine everything you've worked for, your home, your land, your business being taken away simply because of your political allegiance. The proceeds from selling these confiscated estates were often used to fund the war effort. So, in a cruel twist of irony, a Loyalist's life savings could end up paying for the very revolution they opposed. Beyond property loss, many Loyalists faced imprisonment or were forced into internal exile, moved away from strategically important coastal areas. Thousands of Loyalist men took up arms themselves, fighting for the British in dedicated provincial regiments, turning the revolution into a true civil war, where Americans fought against Americans. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, ending the war, it was a moment of triumph for the Patriots. But for the Loyalists, it was a catastrophe. The British had lost, and they were left behind, abandoned in a new nation that viewed them as traitors. The treaty did include a clause recommending that states restore confiscated property to Loyalists, but this was largely ignored. The anger and resentment from years of brutal warfare ran too deep. Mobs attacked returning Loyalists, and state governments refused to cooperate. For many, going home was simply not an option. They faced a future of persecution and poverty in the land of their birth. Faced with this hostile environment, an estimated 60,000 to 100,000 Loyalists made the difficult decision to leave. They became refugees, seeking shelter elsewhere in the British Empire. This mass exodus was one of the largest population shifts in American history at the time. The most common destination was British North America. Over 30,000 Loyalists, including many formerly enslaved black Loyalists who had been promised freedom by the British, settled in Nova Scotia and what would become New Brunswick in Ontario. They were pioneers, carving new lives out of the wilderness and fundamentally shaping the future of Canada. Others sailed to the Caribbean, settling in places like Jamaica and the Bahamas. A smaller, often wealthier group returned to Great Britain itself, though many found it difficult to adjust, feeling like strangers in a land they had always called their mother country. The story of the Loyalists forces us to look at the American Revolution in a new light. It wasn't a simple tale of good versus evil. It was a messy, painful civil war that tore families and communities apart. It reminds us that history is written by the victors, and the voices of those who lost are often silenced. These weren't just abstract Tories. They were Americans with families, principles, and a deep connection to their homes, who ultimately lost everything. Their story is a powerful reminder of the human cost of war and the complex, often tragic, choices people must make during times of great upheaval. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into a lesser-known side of the American Revolution. It's a story that deserves to be told. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we're delving into a chapter of history that is too often overlooked. A story of promises broken and voices silenced. We're talking about the pivotal, yet frequently ignored, role of Native nations in the shaping of North America, particularly in the aftermath of major conflicts like the American Revolution. For centuries, Native American tribes were not just inhabitants of this land. They were powerful political entities, skilled diplomats, and formidable military allies. European powers, and later, the fledgling United States, all vied for their support, forming complex alliances that shaped the very course of history. Tribes like the Iroquois Confederacy, the Cherokee, the Shawnee, and many others were central players, not passive bystanders. They fought, negotiated, and bled for causes they believed in, often based on solemn promises of respect for their sovereignty and protection of their ancestral lands. Imagine being a crucial ally in a massive war. You've strategized, fought alongside powerful armies, and contributed significantly to the outcome. You expect a seat at the table when the time comes to discuss peace and the future. Now, imagine the war ends, and the victors you are supposed to all sit down to draw new maps and sign treaties. But you're not invited. The room is closed, and decisions about your home, your future, and your people are made without you. This was the devastating reality for countless Native nations following the American Revolution. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 is often celebrated as the official end of the war and the birth of the United States. But for the Native American tribes who had allied with both the British and the Americans, it was a moment of profound betrayal. The treaty carved up the continent between Britain, Spain, and the new United States, completely disregarding the fact that vast territories were the sovereign homelands of indigenous peoples. The British, in their haste to make peace, simply handed over lands that were never theirs to give lands they had previously acknowledged as belonging to their native allies through earlier treaties. For the Americans, this new territory represented a boundless opportunity for expansion, a vacant frontier ready to be settled. But it was anything but vacant. It was home. This act of exclusion had catastrophic consequences. The United States government, now feeling emboldened, began to assert its authority over lands west of the Appalachians. They viewed the tribes not as sovereign nations to be negotiated with, but as conquered peoples whose lands were forfeit. This perspective ignored the reality on the ground. Many tribes had not been defeated. Some had even been allied with the victorious Americans. Yet, they were all painted with the same broad brush. Leaders like Joseph Brant of the Mohawk Nation, who had been a staunch ally of the British, were stunned. He and other leaders had fought to protect their people's future, only to find that their allies had abandoned them, signing away their world on a piece of paper thousands of miles away. They were left to face the aggressive expansion of the United States alone. What followed was decades of conflict. The ink on the Treaty of Paris was barely dry when new wars erupted in the Ohio Valley and the Southeast. These weren't random skirmishes. They were wars of resistance. Tribes formed powerful confederacies, like the Western Confederacy led by figures such as Little Turtle of the Miami and Blue Jacket of the Shawnee, to defend their lands against American encroachment. They fought fiercely to uphold the sovereignty that the international treaty had so casually ignored. They argued, rightly, that they had never been conquered and had never ceded their lands. How could a treaty between two foreign powers extinguish their rights? This fundamental question highlights the deep injustice at the heart of this historical moment. The very concept of land ownership differed profoundly. For Native peoples, land was not a commodity to be bought and sold, but a sacred inheritance, the source of life, and the foundation of their culture and identity. The lines drawn on European maps were arbitrary marks that sliced through communities, hunting grounds, and sacred sites. This chapter of history reveals a critical truth. Peace for some can mean devastation for others. The end of the American Revolution was not the beginning of a peaceful era for the continent's first inhabitants. Instead, it marked the start of a new and more intense struggle for survival, a fight to be seen and heard, a battle against an expansionist power that refused to acknowledge their rights or their humanity. They were the silent victims of a peace treaty that sealed their fate without their consent, a legacy of exclusion that would continue to shape the relationship between the United States and Native nations for generations to come. Understanding this history is not about assigning blame. It's about acknowledging the full, complex story of how this nation was formed. It's about recognizing the resilience and resistance of the Native peoples who were written out of their own story. By remembering their role and their betrayal, we gain a more honest and complete picture of our shared past. Thank you so much for joining me today to explore this crucial and often forgotten part of history. If you found this video insightful, please give it a thumbs up, and consider subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into the stories that shape our world. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter. We'll see you next time. Imagine a room filled not with the boom of cannons or the smoke of battle, but with the quiet, electric tension of history being written. The date is September 3rd, 1783. For 8 long years, the American colonies have fought a grueling war for independence against the most powerful empire on earth. Now, in a hotel room in Paris, the final act of this revolutionary drama is about to unfold. This isn't just the end of a war, it's the birth of a nation, formally recognized on the world stage. Today, we're going back in time to witness the signing of the Treaty of Paris, the moment the United States of America officially ceased to be a dream and became a reality. Let's set the scene. The location is the Hotel de York in Paris, a neutral ground for this monumental occasion. Inside, the air is thick with anticipation. On one side of the table sit the American commissioners, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and John Jay. These men are giants of the Revolution, each with a distinct personality. Adams, the fiery lawyer from Massachusetts, ever vigilant of American interests. Franklin, the world-renowned diplomat and scientist, whose charm and wit had been instrumental in securing French support for the war. And John Jay, the sharp, pragmatic New Yorker, who had navigated the complex and often treacherous waters of European diplomacy. Together, they represent a fledgling nation, armed with little more than courage and conviction. Across from them sits David Hartley, the representative of King George III. Hartley is a member of Parliament and a friend to Benjamin Franklin, a man who had long advocated for peace and reconciliation. But he represents the British Crown, a global empire humbled by its former colonies. The weight of this defeat, and the task of formally ceding a vast territory, rests on his shoulders. The document laid out between them is the culmination of months of painstaking, often contentious, negotiations. Every article, every clause, has been debated, redrafted, and scrutinized. The stakes couldn't be higher. This treaty would define the borders, rights, and future of a new country. Let's look at the key articles of this incredible document. Article 1 is the showstopper. It is the moment the world shifted on its axis. In it, His Britannic Majesty, King George III, acknowledges the 13 colonies, naming each one, from New Hampshire to Georgia, to be free, sovereign, and independent states. He relinquishes all claims to the government, property, and territorial rights of the same, for himself and his heirs forever. Think about that for a second. With a few strokes of a pen, an empire formally surrenders its claim over a continent. The abstract ideals declared in 1776 were now being codified into international law. Then comes Article 2, which deals with the borders. This was a huge point of contention. The American negotiators, particularly Jane Addams, pushed for the most expansive territory possible. The treaty established the western boundary of the United States. At the Mississippi River, a staggering acquisition of land that doubled the size of the new nation. The northern border with British Canada was largely set along the Great Lakes, and the southern border was established with Spanish Florida. This vast territory wasn't just empty land. It was a promise, a canvas, upon which the future of the nation would be painted. It was the space for millions to seek their fortune and build new lives. Article 3 was another major victory for the Americans, especially for John Adams, a proud New Englander. It secured fishing rights for American fishermen off the coast of Newfoundland and in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. This might seem like a small detail today, but in the 18th century, the fishing industry, particularly for cod, was a cornerstone of the New England economy. Securing these rights meant securing the livelihoods of thousands and ensuring the economic stability of the northern states. It was a testament to how the American delegates fought not just for grand principles, but for the practical well-being of their people. Of course, the treaty wasn't a one-way street. The British had their own demands. Articles 4, 5, and 6 addressed the treatment of loyalists, those colonists who had remained loyal to the British Crown during the war. These were sensitive and difficult issues. Article 4 stipulated that creditors on both sides could recover their debts. Article 5 earnestly recommended that state legislatures restore the property of loyalists that had been confiscated during the war. This language was intentionally soft. The American delegates knew they couldn't force the states to comply, but it was a necessary concession to reach an agreement. Article 6 promised an end to any future confiscations or prosecutions against loyalists. These articles aimed to heal the deep wounds of a civil war, though in practice, reconciliation would be a long and painful process for many. So, back to the room in Paris. The moment has arrived. The final draft of the treaty is ready. One by one, the men approach the table. We can almost hear the soft scratch of quill pens on the heavy parchment paper. John Adams signs his name, his hands steady, a reflection of his unshakable belief in the American cause. Ten John Hai, the meticulous lawyer, leaving his precise and deliberate signature. And finally, Benjamin Franklin. At 77 years old, frail and suffering from gout, he is the elder statesman. As he signs, he might have reflected on his long journey, from a printer's apprentice in Boston to a celebrated figure on the world stage, now signing the birth certificate of the nation he helped create. On the other side, David Hartley adds his signature, formally sealing the end of Britain's first empire and the beginning of America's story. Once the ink was dry, the delegates exchanged the signed copies. There were no grand celebrations in that room, no cheering crowds outside the window. It was a solemn, profound moment. The war was officially over. The United States of America was no longer a rebellious upstart, but a recognized member of the community of nations. The news would take weeks to cross the Atlantic, but when it did, it set off bells ringing and bonfires blazing from Boston to Savannah. The impossible had been achieved. The signing of the Treaty of Paris was the crucial final step in the American Revolution. It was the culmination of the sacrifices made at Bunker Hill, the perseverance through the winter at Valley Forge, and the decisive victory at Yorktown. It transformed the Declaration of Independence from a bold statement of intent into a geopolitical fact. The treaty provided the nation with not just sovereignty, but with a vast territory full of resources and potential, setting the stage for America's westward expansion and its eventual rise as a global power. It was a diplomatic masterpiece, secured by negotiators who were outmatched in power but not in skill, determination, or vision. So the next time you think about the founding of the United States, don't just picture soldiers on the battlefield. Picture that quiet room in Paris. Picture Adams, Franklin, and Jay, their faces etched with the gravity of the moment as they dipped their quills in ink. In those signatures, we see the courage, the intellect, and the sheer audacity of a generation that dared to build a new world. They weren't just ending a war. They were beginning a nation, an experiment in liberty that continues to this very day. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the moments that shaped our world. Let me know in the comments what part of this story surprised you the most. Until next time, stay curious. Imagine a world holding its breath, a world weary from years of conflict, sacrifice, and uncertainty, a world desperate for good news. Now, imagine a single message, a spark of hope, crossing the vast, cold Atlantic Ocean. This is the story of that message, the story of how peace finally reached America. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we're re-diving into one of the most emotional moments in history. The day news of the war's end arrived on American shores. It was on an instant notification on a smartphone or a breaking news alert on a 24-hour news channel. It was a slow, deliberate journey of information that would unleash a tidal wave of emotion unlike anything the nation had ever seen. The journey of the news itself was a marvel of its time. Transatlantic cables, humming with Morse code, were the first to carry the electrifying words. Telegraph operators in coastal cities, their fingers tapping away in dimly lit rooms, were the first heralds of peace. They would decipher the dots and dashes, their eyes widening as the message became clear. Armistice signed. Can you picture that moment? TOPRT, perhaps a young man who had seen friends go off to war, suddenly holding the single most important piece of information in the world. His heart would have pounded in his chest as he passed the slip of paper to the newsroom. From there, it was a race against time. Newsboys, their voices cracking with excitement, hit the streets yelling extra, extra. War is over. Their shouts cut through the morning air, stopping people in their tracks. A woman on her way to the market, a man heading to the factory. A child playing on the sidewall would have frozen, the word over-echoing in their ears. Was it real? Could they dare to believe it? In the big cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia, the reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The initial disbelief gave way to a collective, primal roar of joy. Office windows flew open, and a blizzard of ticker tape and shredded paper rained down on the streets below, creating a scene of chaotic celebration. Strangers embraced, dancing and singing in the streets. The solemn tolling of church bells, once a sound of mourning, now rang out in a joyous, deafening chorus of victory and relief. It was a citywide party, a spontaneous eruption of pent-up fear, anxiety, and finally, overwhelming happiness. People didn't need an invitation. The shared experience of relief was the only ticket required. But as the news spread inland, carried by trains and trickling into smaller towns and rural communities, the reaction became more personal, more intimate. In these tight-knit places, where everyone knew someone who had served, the news arrived with a different kind of weight. A telephone call to the local post office, a single telegram tacked to a community notice board, for families gathered around their radios, straining to hear the announcer's voice through the static. The confirmation was a moment of profound, earth-shattering relief. Imagine a mother in a small farmhouse in Kansas. Every day for years, she has woken with a knot of fear in her stomach, her thoughts immediately flying to her son in a trench thousands of miles away. She scans the casualty lists in the local paper with a dreadful sense of foreboding. Then, a neighbor comes running across the field, waving a newspaper. She reads the headline, and the strength that has held her together for so long finally gives way. The tears that fall aren't just of joy, but of a deep, bone-weary relief. Her boy is safe. Her boy is coming home. These were tears that washed away years of sleepless nights and silent prayers. For the wives of soldiers, the news was the promise of a future they weren't sure they would ever have. It was the end of lonely nights and the beginning of planning a life together again. They clutched letters from their husbands, rereading promises of return, and for the first time, they could truly believe them. Celebrations in these communities weren't always loud parades. Sometimes, there were quiet moments of gratitude, a family kneeling together in prayer, or neighbors sharing a pot of coffee and stories, their voices thick with emotion. The disbelief was palpable. After so much loss, good news felt fragile, almost dreamlike. People would ask each other again and again, "Is it true? Is it really over?" As if saying the words aloud would make them more real. And what about the soldiers themselves? For those still in training camps across America, preparing to ship out, the news was a sudden, jarring halt. One moment, they were drilling, their minds focused on the grim realities of the battlefield ahead. The next, their sergeants were announcing that it was all over. The reaction was a mix of shock, confusion, and then sheer, unadulterated elation. They had been spared. They would not have to face the horrors their brothers in arms had endured. Caps were thrown into the air, and disciplined soldiers became a jubilant mob, their shouts of relief echoing across the training grounds. For soldiers already wounded and recovering in hospitals on American soil, the news was a different kind of medicine. It was a validation of their sacrifice. Their wounds, their pain, their loss, it had all meant something. It had led to this moment of peace. For them, the celebration was quieter, more reflective. It was a shared look with the man in the next bed, a silent acknowledgement that their part in the great struggle was finished. The end of the war meant they could now focus entirely on one thing: healing and going home, not as soldiers, but as sons, husbands, and fathers. Across the nation, a profound sense of unity emerged. In that moment, political divisions and social differences melted away. Everyone was an American, bound together by a shared experience of sacrifice and a collective sigh of relief. The celebrations that swept the country were more than just parties. They were a national catharsis. It was the moment America could finally begin to exhale, to process the immense cost of the war, and to look toward a future that was, at long last, peaceful. The tears, the cheers, the ticker tape, and the quiet prayers were all part of the same story: a nation's emotional and heartfelt welcome to the end of a long and brutal war. The arrival of the news of peace in America was a complex tapestry of human emotion, from the wild celebrations in the streets of New York to the silent, tearful prayers in a farmhouse on the prairie. It was a moment that touched every single American. It marked the end of an era of unprecedented conflict and the hopeful, uncertain beginning of a new one. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. It's a powerful reminder of how news, and the hope it carries, can unite and move a nation. If you found this story as moving as I did, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the moments that shaped our world. We'd love to have you as part of our community. Until next time, take care. Imagine the scene, December 4th, 1783. The American Revolution, a long and brutal struggle, is finally over. The British have evacuated New York City, and the dream of a new nation is a reality. For 8 long years, one man stood as the unshakable pillar of this revolution: General George Washington. But now, his work as a soldier was done. At Fraunces Tavern in New York, an emotional scene unfolded. Washington gathered his most trusted officers, the men who had braved cane and fire, frozen winters, and the brink of starvation alongside him. These weren't just soldiers. They were his brothers in arms, a family forged in the crucible of war. The atmosphere wasn't one of triumphant celebration, but of a somber, heartfelt goodbye. With a voice thick with emotion, Washington raised a glass. He couldn't deliver a long speech. The words wouldn't come. He simply sighed with a heart full of love and gratitude. "I now take leave of you. I most devoutly wish that your latter days may be as prosperous and happy as your former ones have been glorious and honorable." Imagine the weight of that moment. These men had faced death together, and now they were parting ways, likely forever. One by one, they came forward. Tears streamed down the weathered faces of these hardened generals. They embraced their commander, a man who had earned not just their respect, but their profound love. Major General Henry Knox, the burly chief of artillery, was the first to approach. Washington, himself, overcome, hugged him tightly. Each embrace was a silent acknowledgement of their shared sacrifice, of the impossible odds they had overcome. This wasn't a general dismissing his subordinates. It was a father bidding farewell to his sons. From there, Washington's journey was one of relinquishing power, an act almost unheard of for a victorious military leader in that era. He traveled to Annapolis, where the Continental Congress was meeting, on December 23rd. He stood before the delegates and formally resigned his commission as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. In his address, he spoke not of his own glory, but of the divine providence that had guided them and the incredible perseverance of his soldiers. He handed over his official papers and declared, "Having now finished the work assigned me, I retire from the great theater of action." He was voluntarily giving up immense power, placing the military firmly under civilian control, a cornerstone of the new republic he had fought to create. This act was perhaps his greatest victory. It sent a powerful message to the world. America would not be a military dictatorship, but a nation of laws, governed by the people. Those present were stunned into silence, moved to tears by the sheer humility and integrity of the man before them. He wasn't seeking a crown or a throne. All he wanted was to go home. And so, he did. He journeyed back to his beloved Mount Vernon, arriving on Christmas Eve. He rode up the familiar path to his estate, not as a conquering hero demanding tribute, but as a citizen farmer, Cincinnatus, returning to his plow. He had been away for over 8 years, his home and farm neglected in his absence. He was finally where he had longed to be, reunited with his wife, Martha, ready to live out his days as a private citizen. This return to Mount Vernon is as crucial to understanding Washington's character as any battle he won. It demonstrated that true leadership isn't about accumulating power, but about serving a cause greater than oneself and knowing when to step aside. He had led an army, forged a nation, and then quietly returned to his farm, setting a precedent for peaceful transitions of power that has defined American democracy ever since. Washington's farewell wasn't just an end to a war. It was the powerful beginning of an idea. The idea that a leader could be strong yet humble, powerful yet willing to serve, a general who valued the republic more than his own ambition. It was a lesson in character that would echo through the generations, shaping the very soul of the nation he helped bring into being. His journey from Fraunces Tavern to the halls of Congress, and finally, back to the peaceful fields of Mount Vernon, remains one of the most profound stories of leadership in history. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story as moving as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe for more chapters from the American story. We'd love to have you join our community. See you in the next video. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Last time, we dove deep into the ink and paper of the Treaty of Paris, the document that officially ended the American Revolutionary War. But a treaty isn't just an ending. It's also a beginning. The signatures on that parchment didn't just stop the cannons. They sent out ripples that would reshape the entire globe in ways no one could have predicted. Today, in Chapter 19, we're following those ripples across the oceans, exploring the profound and often unforeseen consequences of American independence. We'll see how this single event triggered financial crises, shifted the focus of empires, and planted the seeds for new revolutions all over the world. So, buckle up, because we're about to see how the birth of one nation changed the destiny of many. Let's start with France, America's crucial ally. On the surface, it was a glorious victory. They had helped humiliate their old rival, Great Britain, and supported a successful fight for liberty. King Louis XVI was celebrated, and French intellectuals praised the American experiment. But beneath the champagne and parades, a fiscal time bomb was ticking. Supporting the American Revolution had cost France an astronomical sum, over 1 billion livres. To put that in perspective, that was more than double the French crown's entire annual revenue. This wasn't just a dent in the royal coffers. It was a catastrophic blow to an already fragile economy. The government was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. To cover these massive debts, the French monarchy had to borrow heavily and raise taxes. But here's the crucial part. Who paid those taxes? Not the privileged clergy or the nobility, who were largely exempt. The burden fell squarely on the shoulders of the third estate, the common people, the merchants, the peasants. Imagine being a French farmer, already struggling to feed your family, and suddenly being told you have to pay even more to cover the cost of a war fought thousands of miles away. The resentment was palpable. This immense financial strain, directly resulting from their involvement in the American War, became a primary catalyst for the French Revolution just a few years later. The very ideals of liberty and no taxation without representation that France had championed in America were now echoing in its own streets, turning against its own king. Now, let's cross the English Channel and look at Great Britain. The loss of the American colonies was, without a doubt, a humbling and painful defeat. It was a massive blow to national pride and prestige. Many in London saw it as the beginning of the end for the British Empire. But history has a funny way of surprising us. Instead of collapsing, the British Empire adapted. It pivoted. Losing the 13 colonies forced British policymakers to fundamentally rethink their imperial strategy. With their focus no longer consumed by North America, they turned their gaze eastward, toward Asia, and specifically, toward India. This shift is what some historians call the swing to the east. Britain began to consolidate its power in India, transforming the British East India Company from a trading entity into a de facto colonial government. They expanded their administrative control, their military presence, and their economic exploitation of the subcontinent. The resources and markets of India, Burma, and beyond became the new jewels in the imperial crown, far surpassing what the American colonies had ever offered. So, in a strange twist of fate, the American victory for independence inadvertently accelerated the colonization and subjugation of millions in Asia. It wasn't a collapse of the British Empire, but a dramatic and consequential reorientation that would define global politics for the next century and a half. But the ripples didn't stop there. The American Revolution was the first successful colonial uprising against a major European power in modern history. It was proof. It was a tangible example that a group of determined people could defy an empire and forge their own destiny. This idea was electric, and it spread like wildfire. In Latin America, figures like Simon Bolivar and José de San Martin, the great libertadores, closely studied the American model. They read the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. They saw how a colonial society, much like their own, could throw off the yoke of a distant European monarch in Tercasse, Spain and Portugal. The American success story provided both a philosophical blueprint and a source of inspiration, fueling the Latin American wars of independence that would erupt in the early 19th century. The message was clear. If the Americans could do it, why couldn't they? This sentiment wasn't confined to the Americas. In Poland, reformers fighting for a more liberal constitution against the influence of Russia and Prussia looked to the American example. In Ireland, patriots agitated for greater autonomy from British rule, energized by what their counterparts across the Atlantic had achieved. Even within the monarchies of Europe, the American Revolution sparked a new and dangerous conversation about the rights of man, the nature of government, and the legitimacy of kings. It demonstrated that the Enlightenment ideals weren't just abstract theories for philosophers to debate. In salons, they could be put into practice to create a real, functioning republic. So, when we look back at the Treaty of Paris, we see it's far more than just the end of a war. It was a global inflection point. For France, the victory was a Pyrrhic one, leading directly to a financial crisis that would topple its own monarchy. For Britain, a humiliating defeat paradoxically triggered an imperial pivot that made its empire larger and more powerful than ever before, just in a different part of the world. And for aspiring revolutionaries and reformers across the globe, from the capitals of Europe to the mountains of South America, the birth of the United States was a beacon of hope. It was a powerful demonstration that the world did not have to be ruled by old empires and hereditary kings. A new age of revolution had dawned. The world had been shaken, and it would never be the same again. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the global ripples of the American Revolution. It's a powerful reminder that history is an interconnected web where one event can have countless unforeseen consequences. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button. And be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next chapter. We'd love to have you with us as we continue to explore the past. Thanks for watching, and see you next time. Hello, history enthusiasts, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we're embarking on a journey back to a pivotal moment, a time when the ink was still wet on the pages of destiny. We're diving into Chapter 20. A new nation begins. This isn't just a story of dates and documents. It's the chronicle of an idea, the audacious, revolutionary idea of liberty taking its first breath. Imagine the atmosphere. The smoke of revolution has cleared, and in its place is the dawn of a new era. For the first time, the people have collectively decided to govern themselves, to cast off the shackles of monarchy and forge their own path. This was more than just a political shift. It was a profound human experiment. The air was thick with a mix of exhilaration and uncertainty. They had fought for freedom, and now they had it. The question that loomed large was, what do we do with it? The dream of liberty, whispered in taverns and proclaimed on battlefields, was finally a tangible reality. Think about the weight of that moment. Farmers, merchants, scholars, ordinary people were now citizens of a republic, vested with the power to shape their own government. The principles they championed, ideas of inalienable rights, of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, were no longer just philosophical concepts. They were the very foundation upon which they would build their new world. This wasn't a blueprint handed down from on high. It was a blank canvas. The founding generation had to invent what it meant to be an American. They had to create a national identity from a patchwork of 13 distinct colonies, each with its own culture, economy, and interests. How do you unite a fisherman from Massachusetts with a planter from Georgia? You give them a shared story, a common purpose. You give them the Constitution. The creation of the Constitution was a monumental feat of compromise and vision. It was a negotiation, a debate, a struggle to balance power. How do you create a government strong enough to be effective, but not so strong that it threatens the very liberties it was created to protect? This was the central paradox. The framers grappled with this, arguing fiercely over representation, states' rights, and the powers of the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. What emerged was a masterpiece of political engineering, a system of checks and balances designed to endure. But a document, no matter how brilliant, is only a piece of paper. The real challenge was making it work. The first few decades of this new nation were a trial by fire. There were economic crises, internal rebellions, and the ever-present threat of interference from European powers, who were watching this democratic experiment with a skeptical and often hostile eye. Every decision, from establishing a national bank to navigating foreign policy, set a precedent for generations to come. This period was defined by its giants, visionary leaders who, despite their flaws and their often fiery disagreements, shared a commitment to the Republic. They were architects of a new political language, debating in the halls of Congress and in the pages of newspapers, shaping the public's understanding of this new form of government. They were building the ship while sailing it, navigating the treacherous waters of factionalism and regional division. The struggle for unity was paramount. The very concept of we the people was revolutionary. It implied a collective identity that superseded loyalty to one's state or town. Forging this unity required more than just laws. It required a shared culture, a national story. Myths and heroes were created. Symbols like the flag became sacred, and a sense of shared destiny began to take root. But this process was not inclusive of everyone. The ideals of liberty and equality rang hollow for vast segments of the population, a contradiction that would become the nation's greatest challenge. As we reflect on the birth of this new nation, we see a story of incredible triumph and profound complexity. The dream of liberty was realized, a beacon of hope for people around the world. A government of the people, by the people, and for the people was no longer just a philosopher's fantasy. But this beginning was not an ending. It was the start of an ongoing journey. The challenges they faced achieving unity, defining the role of government, and shaping a national identity are challenges that continue to resonate today. The republic they created was not a perfect machine, but a living, evolving organism, entrusted to each new generation to nurture, to question, and to improve. The story of this new nation is a powerful reminder that freedom is not a destination, but a constant process. It's a call to active citizenship, a legacy of debate and progress. The founders gave us a framework, a starting point. The rest, as they say, is history, our history, which we are all still writing together. Thank you so much for joining me on this exploration of a new nation's beginning. If you found this journey as fascinating as I did, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter. We'll see you next time.